everyone to another episode of FO Live. My name is Geneva and I will be your moderator today, and we're joined by three incredible individuals, Dennis Allison, Dr. Banning Garrett, and Dr. Mark Cummings. So thank you very much all for joining us. If I can please pass over to each of our guests to introduce themselves. Dennis, over to you.
Okay, my name is Dennis Allison. I am on the faculty at Stanford in the electrical engineering department. My training has been in physics, and I'm a technologist and a futurist.
My name is Mark Cummings. I have an ability to see, to look at really complex systems and begin to see patterns and then to see how things work and to see how things might be made better. That ability started me in the information industry, and I was able to see that if we made a healthier information system, we could have a healthier society. And I was able to do stuff in that area. And I'm with everything going on, and especially Dennis whispering in my ear with very serious intent for many years about the climate problem that we face and the connections between it and what we now call the Polycrisis. I started trying to understand it, and in the last week or so, with the help of Banning, it became clear to me that we're in a period right now that's very similar to where the world was before Pearl Harbor, before the United States entered the Second World War. In the United States, nobody could decide what to do. There were people who were, against war on principle, people who didn't want to have another European war, people who thought Hitler was actually doing the right thing. There was an American Nazi party. There were people who wanted to enter the war. It was all scattered. And then Pearl Harbor happened, and we had this, all of a sudden, this condensed political will. And we were able to do amazing things in a very short period of time. And I feel like that's where we are now. We don't have the political will. We know that we face a crisis, probably the biggest crisis the human race has faced in its history. And we just don't seem to be able to muster the political will to address it.
I'm Banning Garrett. I've got kind of a strange background. I've worked on U.S.-China relations for about 40 years and carried on a unofficial strategic dialogue between the U.S. and China for about 20 years. I worked on long-term global trends. I was at the Atlantic Council and worked with the National Intelligence Council, go around the world and get global input looking at long-term global trends, and also took people to Silicon Valley and tried to understand the technological piece of the puzzle. So I'm very interested in the issues that Mark has already started to raise, of the climate crisis compounding with all the other global trends and challenges and long-term just persistent disruption which we're facing. But I also see some emerging opportunities too. So I'm not all doom and gloom, but we face very big challenges.
Thank you very much, all of you, for introducing yourselves. So as has already been alluded to, today we're going to discuss the idea of political will and its impact on the polycrisis facing the world today, namely how the inability of humanity to cooperate is preventing us from solving a lot of these issues. So the first question to the three of you is, what do you each understand political will to mean? And what is your broad thesis on how we currently stand in regards to global issues, particularly perhaps in comparison to each other?
Climate change by itself is creating stresses which are making every one of the other serious crises we face. The level of violence is going up, as we can see in Ukraine. The threat of nuclear war is now on the table. We still have not gotten out of the last pandemic. And I say last because observers believe that we're in for a series of pandemics. The effect of the Ukraine war on food insecurity, particularly in Africa, has been dramatic. But we see food insecurity now all over the world, and problems with availability of fresh water. There was a report yesterday, I don't remember, is it 30 or 30% of the population of the planet does not have reliable access to clean water. All of these things are just going to get worse as a result of ongoing climate change. And we kind of know what to do to stop it from getting worse. And there are some technology things that we can do that might make it better, but we just don't seem to be able to do them.
Well, I think one of the questions is why isn't there political will? I mean, I totally agree. I think the biggest threat to humanity is our inability to cooperate and facing a common challenge that's existential. We can't do it. And actually, the Homo sapiens seem to have been the dominant species when we had Neanderthals and other humanoids, because they had an ability to cooperate on a larger scale than the family or the immediate tribe. And there was an ability to understand that we could act together with others to deal with, I don't know, war, deal with fishing, deal with all kinds of things. So inherent in our species is an ability to cooperate on a pretty large scale. So the question is, why can't we cooperate when we see these? And as Mark said, we actually know what we face. Interestingly, on the one hand, the future is probably more uncertain today how it's going to play out than at any time in the past. On the other hand, we know more about the future than we've ever known, because of particularly through science. I mean, we know the kinds of challenges we face. We know about global warming. We're sitting looking at the end of the century that if we continue on a certain path, we can have 3 or 4 degrees centigrade increase in the temperature of the Earth atmosphere, and with horrendous implications for the human race. So we know that. We know about a whole lot of things, more than we ever knew in the past. We were able to foresee, because of our scientific capability, our analytic capability, our social sciences. We have a lot of knowledge, and yet, we face this huge uncertainty, and that's the human piece of it. What are humans going to do? And I think that's a very, very serious problem. I would throw into the mix of the political will the question of trust. And by that trust, I mean that in a basic trust in society. In the United States, we face a situation now where there's deep mistrust of government, deep mistrust of the media, deep distrust of the elites, deep mistrust, everybody mistrusting everybody else. So experts actually are important. And here, if you look at the pandemic, this is where it gets very depressing. You have science. We know a lot, I mean, obviously the COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 was a moving target to understand it, to understand how it would play out, what you had to do about it. But we went very rapidly and creating vaccines. And we had a very good idea of the kinds of things you need to do to minimize the danger, including wearing masks, getting vaccinated. And we had experts telling it, Dr. Fauci, we had all the NIH, we have the CDCs, we have these amazing collections of scientists who work so hard, and yet there's a huge portion of the population didn't trust them, didn't trust the mask mandates, and didn't trust the vaccines. And why is this? I mean, we've been eroding trust in the people who we actually pay. We create government and we pay people to do this stuff, to be the experts at the NIH or CDCs or whatever. And this is a global phenomenon. And yet there's a huge part of the population who doesn't trust them. And the fact is, when it comes to climate change or any things we need to do, you need a certain amount of trust where people say, well, I really am not a climate expert. I don't really, I have no, but I trust the people in government are telling me the truth. And this is a serious crisis and we need to do X, Y, and Z to deal with it. So within countries, we don't have that level of trust. It's been eroded, and you can blame a lot of people for eroding it. It isn't just the people who don't trust. I mean, I remember Nixon, I remember the Pentagon Papers, I remember a lot of things that eroded trust in the United States. I think this is true throughout the world. So within our nations, we can't get the kind of trust of leadership that we can say, oh, I believe that what the leaders are saying is something that we have to do to change course, to cooperate with other nations. to meet the challenge of climate change or a whole host of other global challenges. So that's a big problem. How do you get the political will within a country for this? And then, of course, we can go on and talk about geopolitics. We can talk about all the things going on in the international arena that are eroding the institutions, the United Nations and a whole host of treaties. Arms control now is out the window. I mean, so there's an international and a national piece to this question of why we don't have political will to address the very big challenges that we obviously face. Dennis.
Okay, you guys are optimists of the first order. You see the world only in terms of gorgeous rainbows and unicorns and things like that. I'm not. I'm just a little bit less excited about the whole thing. I think that we could in fact deal with global warming, and we should have started in 1940 or maybe 1930. Well, maybe 1920 or thereabouts. In any case, we're in a very difficult place because things are falling apart. They're falling apart rapidly. You talk about waiting until the end of the century for the hammer to fall on us. I'd say that we're probably much more likely to have the hammer fall on us in at the turn of the half century. I'd say that we're in deep trouble, really deep trouble in 2050, and we'll see major things in 2040 or 2030, and little things like rainstorms and floods and tornadoes and hurricanes and so forth, off and on from today on. It's not that we don't have political will, it's that the political will is trying to worry about things like significant but not dominant. Today's news was filled with a person who killed a bunch of kids at a school, and that's very sad for the kids and sad for the adults who were killed. But it's almost in the noise when you look at the problems that global warming is going to cause in the next 20 years. It's going to kill many, many, many people. So I think we have trouble. Our trouble is that we can't focus on things which are in the future, complicated, and not necessarily completely certain, but for which the evidence is very strong and requires that every human being on the planet cooperate and work together. And we don't have the will to do that.
I would say that the pandemic sort of proves Dennis's point. I mean, here you had a threat that probably the first time in the history of humans that every human on the planet faced the same threat at the same time or within a very short time period. We all faced the pandemic. It was not like an abstract threat of climate change, which hurts some people here and then some people there and others there, with different phenomena, with sea level rise or extreme weather or forest fires or whatever. And you could say, oh, it's too bad what's happening to those people in California where the fires rage or whatever. But everybody was facing it, and yet we really didn't come together as a global community. There was a leadership attempt to do it. So it's not totally negative, but I think particularly because the United States and President Trump, if the United States, if Biden or let's say Hillary Clinton were president, I suspect that the US would have played a much more positive global role trying to look at the global problem rather than me first, America first, and then just sort of denying the problem and mishandling it. So there might have been a different outcome, but you can't blame just the United States. I think it was very hard for every country to kind of come, say, hey, we're all in this together. Let's all work together to solve the problem. And this was a really easy one in the sense that, like I said, it was clear what it was. It's everybody at the same time. The kinds of measures to deal with it were pretty simple, from masking to vaccines, et cetera. When you look at something like climate change, it's a far more complex phenomena and far more spread out over time. And like I said, different people, different parts of the world are going to suffer differently at different times. So how do you forge a community around that kind of a problem? I mean, humanity's never faced anything like that. The worst we had it. Now, if you go back to what Mark said, if you look at World War II, I find it very interesting that, in 1941, the United States produced 3 million cars. After between 42 and 45, the United States produced 139 cars, but 297 fighters and other aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, something around 150 aircraft carriers in 3 years. And I say that, and by the end of the war, the US had 50% of industrial production in the world was in the United States. And it went, the point being that if we put our minds to it, if we say, okay, we do have the political will, we're going to mobilize all the resources that we need to deal with it, going to an energy transition quickly to net zero, let's say. It's conceivable. I mean, that's why I'd cite World War II. Just look how we ramped up. We stopped doing a whole lot of things, and Ford Motor Company wasn't making cars anymore, right? And making bombers, but I think they were turning out one B-24 bomber every 63 seconds. I mean, it's the quantities are just astonishing. It takes us about 20 years to make 100 F-35s or something like that. But in any case, the potential is there. So again, it goes back to call it political will or whatever you want to say. Why don't we do this, or how do we try to overcome this real problem? And does it take a major crisis? Because Mark pointed to Pearl Harbor. That was the American crisis, and led us into World War II in both the Pacific and the European theaters. So what do we need to have some terrible disaster? I mean, our friend Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote The Ministry for the Future, which I highly recommend to people, because before he wrote it, he wanted to write something where things go right, so that it's not a dystopian novel about climate change where we all die. We get to a place on a path of economic and environmental sustainability by 2050. But it opens with this terrible heat wave in a wet bulb 35-degree heat wave. And when you have wet bulb 35 degrees, that's a combination that's Celsius, of humidity and heat. And it's certain that combination, when you hit 35 wet bulb, you can't sweat. You just start to poach, basically. So you die within a few hours. Anyways, in the book, there's like 2 weeks of this wet bulb 35-degree heat wave over parts of India, and 20 million people die. And that sets off a whole set that leads to the Ministry for the Future to try to focus people on climate change. And, that's the Pearl Harbor that he puts in his book. I recommend, if you want to get a sense of what climate change might look like to people, read that chapter. You'll get a feel for what it would be, because it's all about the protagonist as an aid worker and just trying to focus on
this idea that fiction and drama can help us understand. There's also this whole series now on Apple TV Plus called Extrapolation, which I read Kim Stanley Robinson's novel, and I could read it because I had enough separation. It was print, but it's very hard for me to watch Extrapolation it's emotionally so devastating. But the other side of the coin is why aren't we? And why aren't we pulling together? And the reason is because there are groups of people and individuals who have parochial interests that think that they can achieve their personal objectives by working against any attempt to create the political will necessary. They would like to use the political will energy to meet their own personal objectives, whether they be profit motives or personal power motives or national power motives. And if you go and Banning is very eloquent talking about the change that happened in the US and what people can do when they really put the political will together. But before that happened, there were people who thought that there was not a crisis, that Hitler was actually doing the right thing, and that everybody should just get behind Hitler and everything would be great. And Hitler is an example, I think, of that kind of behavior, which is trying to divert political will for personal power, national power. I win, you lose. The problem is, in this world, nobody, if anybody doesn't win, nobody wins, everybody loses. And we haven't got that recognition yet.
Well, Mark, we don't do anything. For the most part, not much gets done, period. For example, we had fire season last summer. There were major fires in various places. The quantity of carbon dioxide dumped into the atmosphere as a result of those fires is horrendously large. But we didn't mobilize every human being in the country to fight those fires. We allow fires to go on in Brazil and in Indonesia and other places where the quantity of materials dumped into the atmosphere is very high. We allow oil and gas facilities to output methane, just outgas methane. We allow them to burn flames or flares to get rid of waste methane, which is a fuel that just they burn because, well, we don't know where to store it. Or just all sorts of little things along the way, all of which add up to a very large amount of damage to the planet. And I ask you and Banning, would you guys be willing to take the next 10 years and spend full time working to control global warming? Just put your life on hold and take 10 years. Olivia, would you?
I think that's. You'd also have to ask, what should you do to combat global warming? I mean, what is it individuals need to do, or all the different things that individuals need to do? I mean, talking on this podcast is part of an effort to raise the issue, clarify it, try to find some direction. That's a role. It's hardly the role of the people who are out there in the front lines, dealing with the climate refugees in Africa, of which there may be 50 million, maybe more. I mean, yeah, there's so many things that need to be done. There's mitigation, adaptation, consequence management. There's the whole range of stuff. But I mean, I think it's much. We have to get government policy and governments that are willing to do interesting things. For example, in Robinson's book, he basically has a sense that the question of the incentives in the economy. What are the incentives? The incentives now are to drill for and mine and mine coal, drill for oil and gas, and produce it, and exploit the planet and destroy it. Basically, that's the incentives. What if you change the incentives? And in the book, there's it's a whole story, but they have carbon coin where you get paid to sequester carbon. You get paid to keep it in the ground if you control it. You get paid to rewild the country. And it's incentives. You can make money doing that. And I think if you look at now, we already have the Inflation Reduction Act, weirdly named IRA, where we're putting hundreds of billions of dollars into subsidizing and incentivizing electric vehicles, solar production, et cetera. And so, government can play a big role in changing the incentive system and, in mobilizing people either through direct fiscal stimulus or monetary steps, or just simply creating markets that are going to move us in the direction that is the way we want to go. I mean, this is hardly enough right now. I mean, clearly, as Dennis said, we're already facing humongous threats.
Banning, if we look at the Inflation Reduction Act, to me, that's like the Lend-Lease program before Pearl Harbor. So the United States could not get its political will together to actually take full action. So there was this little compromise that was worked out. The American Nazi Party was still functioning. The black shirts were still running around. The Bund was still operating in the US. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt was able to get the Lend-Lease program to start shipping material to Great Britain
and Russia.
And that was an important, but it wasn't. It was kind of like a drop in the bucket, but it was the beginning, and so we do have a beginning.
Yeah.
The problem that I see,
Mark, I think you're wrong. Look at what does an electric vehicle do? Why is an electric vehicle really a useful thing to do in terms of global warming? Well, it's because maybe power generation is a more efficient mechanism for creating energy than burning a gasoline in an engine. But it's a readjustment of where the energy is created, and doesn't really have a lot to do with anything else. It doesn't somehow create energy for free. It just simply moves around and maybe makes it less polluting.
Well,
the same thing is
no,
true about
Dennis,
getting
I don't
other
think.
things.
Wait a minute, Dennis. That's no. Hang on. Time out. Dennis, that is not absolutely true. Okay, so if we can move to power, we need power. That's, we need food, we need air, we need water, and we need power in the modern world. If we can find ways to generate, store, distribute, and use power that do not put carbon or methane into the atmosphere, that is a positive step.
We haven't found that yet.
Well, we have wind generation, we have water hydro generation, we have a solar generation. I believe that that wave and tidal generation are going to be the last link in the chain.
If you look at the system's cost, though, over the full lifetime, most of those are a wash. They don't save you energy.
I don't care whether they save energy or not. I just care what happens to the waste material. Do they produce carbon that goes in the atmosphere? Do they produce methane that goes in the atmosphere? If they reduce the amount of carbon and methane that go in the atmosphere, that's a step in the right direction.
Might be a step in the right direction, but how much facility is needed in order to accomplish that? One of the problems is that everything has a lead time. And if you're gonna build a large scale global energy system, you're gonna spend decades doing it. And we don't have decades.
Okay, so we're back to.
So we should just stop doing anything.
Wait a minute. We're back to this thing. On the west coast of the United States, Kaiser Industries produced a Liberty ship every hour. That's impossible. You can't, everybody says it's impossible, but they did it. And they did it because there was the political will to do it. Ford Motor Company turning out a bomber every 63 minutes in 41? Banning?
Be 43 probably.
43. Okay. That
We didn't do shit in 1941.
yeah,
That was the problem, right?
Yeah, right.
We needed a little
So-
warning, a little attack to get us going.
if there's a political will, very amazing things can be done. Right now, with the Inflation Reduction Act, we don't have the political will. They're little things, and yeah, they're moving in the right direction, and it's better than nothing. But it's not enough. It's not enough, and it's not fast enough. And your point is right, Dennis. It's got to be enough, and it's got to be fast enough. And that
And it has to be effective enough and have long-term thing and so forth. So are you willing to give up your automobiles?
Well, I think that,
To give up all your automobiles.
here's the problem. That's a phony question. It
Of
depends
course.
on where you live. I don't think that, I mean, I lived in Berlin for a year and a half and we had no car. The public transportation system and in your urban area didn't need a car, and rented a car once or twice to go on a short vacation. So car it's the infrastructure. You have to I'm now in Eugene. You cannot live here without a car. You can't walk to the stores. You can't do the things you can do in a city like Berlin. You need a car. However, also Eugene, Oregon happens to have 97% of its electricity is produced without fossil fuels. Most of it's hydro, and then there's some biomass and nuclear, et cetera. So and I bought an EV. So, I'm making some tiny little contribution to not consuming fossil fuels and still moving. Now, you would have to use fossil fuels ultimately, probably, I mean, theoretically, you wouldn't have to if we get there to make the car. Right. I mean, you got to produce all the pieces that go into the car. So if you life cycle it, yeah, sure, you're not solving the problem completely. But I think you more have to take it off the level of individual responsibility. I should stop driving a car and be walking, to say, how do we build, what's the plan? In other words, if we want to get to this place where we rapidly reduce emissions to somehow meet, and now the IPCC with the report that came out a few days ago is saying that we're going to blow right past 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in global warming if we, without some heroic efforts. Well, we are going to blow past it, but how much past it, and how much, what do we need? What do we need to do? And there's a whole combination of things. It's not one thing. There's a lot of things to do if we're going to try to, reduce emissions by 60% by 2035, which is, I think, what they call for. And we have to get to net zero, at least in the rich world, by 2040. So the goals are huge. And so how do you work backward from your goal and say, well, what do we do? And what do we do that people can live with? I mean, you can't ask people to not have some kind of automobile in the western part of the United States, except maybe in some of the big cities. It's not reasonable. People have to get to food. They have to get to jobs. They have to get to healthcare. So you're going to say, how are we going to deal this? Well, so on that level, cars, okay, let's make them at least electric and have the electricity grid be, on renewables and not on fossil fuels. So how do we do that as quickly as possible? I mean, it's a whole set of things we have to do. We have to rewild. We have to do, amazing things to be done. We don't have a plan. That's why I look at Stan Robinson's book and said it's sort of like a plan. And he would reject the idea it's a plan. But this is a pathway to get to where we need to be. Well, let's talk about that pathway.
Okay, so there's two problems. So we've got the political will problem. The other problem, Dennis, which is that the effects of climate change are actually happening right now, and it's making it harder. So for example, I may not be able to finish this Zoom session because we have, where I am in the San Francisco Peninsula, we have an unprecedented weather situation this year. And the last 2 Tuesdays, we've had cyclonic winds that have knocked out the power and taken the cell system down, the internet down, and knocked everybody's power out. And so it's not going to get easier as we go forward, because we're going to be struggling with the effects already. And Banning was talking about the number of climate change refugees in Africa.
What can we do, Mark, which can be accomplished and have substantial changes in lifestyle and consumption and pollution in the next 10 years?
I'm not concerned with what we can do. I think there's plenty of people who have laid out plenty of things that can be done. The problem is to get the political will to actually do them.
Well, I think that's the first step in any such plan, is getting people to agree to do that. And I haven't seen, I'm supposed to give it up because I haven't seen anybody doing anything.
Dennis, when Pearl Harbor happened, nobody knew what to do. It wasn't that everybody said, okay, well, let's stop everything and we'll create a plan. What happened was the political will came, and then bam. Then everybody started putting the plans together, and then the action happened. And
Right.
and
No, do you want to finish your comment and then I'll move us on?
well, I was just going to move on to how do we get that political will? I think that's the really interesting question. What can we do to get the political will? And to me, these kinds of things, and I've been cutting out parts of my life to do these kinds of things, Dennis, not 100% of my life, but as much as I can, and I hope to do more. But then I look at the creative process. Banning talks about Kim Stanley Robinson and his novel, and I look at the extrapolation stuff on, and I'm thinking maybe we need to get more, maybe we need to have rock and roll music songs about the problem. Maybe we need to have first run movies. Maybe we need to have a sitcom. I don't know, but there's that's what I'm thinking, that somehow we've got to build this political will. And I think it comes through communications activities.
Right.
Geneva, please take us forward.
No, thank you very much for that discussion. I think that was very detailed and gave us a lot to think about. But we've spoken quite a lot about climate change, and one of the big surprises to a lot of people was the environmental degradation caused by the war in Ukraine. So I want to shift our focus a little bit towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the interaction or lack thereof by other states in stopping it or helping the Ukrainian people. And I want to ask all of you how you think the reaction of the global community to the Russian invasion of Ukraine can be explained by this thesis of political will. And what, if we take Mark's question, do you think is required for people to change their perspective on it and to really intervene and to stop it in a way that's perhaps meaningful to the Ukrainian people? Dennis, do you want to start us off?
Me? Yeah.
You.
Sure. Okay. I think the war in Ukraine is a disaster on a large number of levels. It's a war. That's not a useful thing, but it's causing a great deal of carbon dioxide to be generated, and
100 million tons.
Yes, and there's an awful lot of lead being spread around the breadbasket of the Ukrainian wheat fields, and it's really terrible. We're concerned, I think, for two reasons that really are significant. For one, I think everyone is tiptoeing around the aggression of the Russians because of the fact that the Russians have a fairly large number of nuclear weapons, and everyone is fearful that the Russians are going to roll out and use tactical nuclear weapons. They're now moving them to Belarus. and that will have a first use of tactical nuclear weapons in a fringe war. And I think that's a real concern. The other thing that's significant is that this is an exercise of power, and it's being done in part by blackmail. The Russians were very clever in becoming a primary energy supplier for Europe. And so Europe is concerned about losing a source of energy. And energy is necessary for modern life. And even though the European community is very, very good at conserving energy relative to the US, it still is necessary to have. And I think that the Russian control of energy has made it very difficult for some European countries to stand really aggressively against the Russian invasion.
I think I would take probably a slightly different tack. The Russians, because you asked the question about political will and responding to Russia. First of all, if Donald Trump had been president, it's a pretty good chance the United States would have said, it's yours, to Putin. And Trump has talked about and has reiterated recently that view, and also that he would disband NATO. So leadership actually matters a lot. And Biden and his team, Blinken and Austin, et cetera, and Jake Sullivan played an incredible role, really, in mobilizing NATO in response to the Ukrainian invasion, to the great surprise, I think, of Vladimir Putin, who really thought that his energy dependence that Dennis mentioned, and the United States, the decadence of the West and all that, and the people would stand by and say, take it, like they did with Ukraine, with Crimea and the Eastern Ukraine in 2014. There was no really serious reaction to that. And the Germans very foolishly, not only, foolishly got into Nord Stream 1 and then Nord Stream 2 to get the gas to the Russians, and got the SPD got very deeply financially involved in that. And after 2014, you would have thought they would at least have scuttled Nord Stream 2, which they didn't. And so it got all to the point it was ready to be operational. And then because of the war, the invasion of Ukraine, the Germans backed off, and Schultz finally did. But the Russians calculated they could use the energy dependence to keep the Russians from supporting Ukraine. But in fact, NATO has been very strong in responding to the Russian invasion, and without the weaponry, mostly from the US, but certainly from other NATO countries, I think that Ukraine would have been in a very, very difficult position. So the backing of Ukraine by the West, Europe, United States, and our allies in Asia, Japan, Australia, South Korea, in particular, has been actually quite strong. And certainly there's a great deal of concern about any engagement directly between two nuclear powers, which we could talk about it. And that's why I think the notion of a US-China war is really way overstated, because we never fired BB guns at the Soviet Union because we were afraid of nuclear escalation. And I would say that still is true, because once you start a direct war, if it's so important to go to war between, let's say, the US and China, or the US and Russia, at what point do you say, oh, I'm losing, you win, didn't mean it, have a nice day? Or do you escalate to the next level of weaponry that you have to try to salvage a victory, or at least prevent defeat? And then on that escalation ladder are tactical nukes and ultimately strategic nuclear weapons. So that's why I don't think we will go to war with China, because it's too bloody dangerous. And nuclear annihilation is not a good outcome for either country. So, but the fear of that kind of escalatory problem, if we had a direct NATO Russian war, is realistic. And on the other hand, I think that, Russia's not going to use TAC nukes. There's no value in them. There's very little battlefield usage, and the reaction of the world and even the Chinese would be extremely negative. So I think that threat's one thing, which is, typical Putin, but using them is another. Now, the other piece of it is, why aren't China and India and a whole lot of the global South, gung-ho supporting the West on Ukraine? And that's a complicated issue. But I think part of it is that the Russian propaganda that has been loudly broadcast by the Chinese has been very effective. It's saying, oh, it's NATO aggression, NATO expansion, the poor Russians, they just had to protect their western border, blah, blah, blah. And they bought into that. And it's been just over and over. So the poor Russians are just, kind of defensive against NATO. And I think this is utter hogwash. And from terms of the reality. And if you read Putin's own documents, particularly his big essay in July 2021, saying basically there is no Ukraine, that Russia must unite go back to the imperial Russia. We have to bring Ukraine back into being part of Russia. And this is essential for the revitalization of Russia, make Russia great again. So the NATO expansion is an excuse. I mean, NATO expanded a long time ago, right? And NATO hasn't been doing anything aggressive against Russia prior to, February 24th, 2021, 2022, excuse me. So what's the story about NATO? Wasn't doing anything. And by the way, all these countries wanted to be in NATO, and Ukraine wants to be in NATO, and Georgia and other countries. It's not NATO pushing themselves on the countries. The countries fear the Russians and want to be part of it. And certainly Poland and Hungary are very glad they're part of NATO and the Baltics. So this whole excuse about NATO expansion is a lot of nonsense, but it's repeated throughout the developing world. And it's repeated in India, becomes the rationale for saying, oh, well, yeah, it's bad that the Russians are killing all these people, but really they had to, to defend themselves against NATO. So the propaganda war is very important here. And of course, there's a lot of, you can point to the United States. We invaded Iraq, I mean, we didn't try to annex territory or anything, or, but, a lot of people would point to the US and the whataboutism and all that sort of thing. So there's a lot of reasons that I think we don't have a global consensus, even though the United Nations, I think only 4 countries voted with the Russians on the sort of condemnation. But it's hard, and the propaganda wars work, and the U.S. Its own record is not so sterling, and so it again goes back to trust and who do you believe and all this stuff that interferes with trying to mobilize global opinion. But I mean, if you want to take it, the next point about Ukraine is that it's a real threat to the global order. If Russia can take over a neighboring country and get away with it, then that means any kind of notion, going back to the United Nations and the protection of sovereignty, which is the Russians, in 1994, they acknowledged Ukrainian sovereignty as part of the deal to get the nuclear weapons out of Ukraine that were left over from the Soviet Union. So they're violating an agreement they signed. But that's a global order. We don't go invade, take over countries because the big, strong country doesn't take over the weak country on its border. That's part of the global order. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of things that if the Russians were to succeed in taking over Ukraine, that is just kind of the end of the international order as we know it. And what is it going to replace it? So, and again, you undermine the international order, then you undermine the basis for cooperation on climate change and a whole lot of other things that we really care about. So,
Banning,
yeah, sorry.
Would you support taking the Ukraine and putting it into NATO?
I would think that if, as a result of this war, Ukraine needs some kind of security guarantee, because if there's, for example, a lot of people pushed, well, we should have a political settlement and at least a ceasefire, and the Russians kind of stay in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, and then but the Russians clearly cannot be trusted. So if you had that kind of a temporary settlement, they just come right back to when they're strong enough to try to take it again. So what would constitute a security guarantee?
Why did we not complain extremely aggressively when the Russians took over Crimea?
That's a
And
very
okay.
good question.
So
I
let's,
would have thought that would have been
We
a
failed.
do that, you're going to be in caught in a war sort of situation.
okay, so I'd like, again, I was not alive when the Second World War was underway, but I grew up in the shadow of the Second World War. And there's a whole group of historians who say that the Second World War was a result of the Western Allies' inability to respond to the Sudetenland, to Hitler's Lebensraum argument. These are German-speaking people, and they should be part of Germany, which is essentially the same argument that Putin is using today. My mother said that those people were wrong, that the Second World War actually started with the Japanese invasion of China. And there's another group of people who say my mother was wrong, that it started with the Japanese invasion of Korea. Now, if we look at what Russia's doing, we start with the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, then the Russian participation in the civil war in Syria, and essentially turning Syria into a part of the Russian Empire. And then you're right, the pieces of Ukraine that had been picked off. We got to a point where the leadership of most of the countries in the Western world, not the South, because they have their own set of issues, realized that if a line was not drawn in Ukraine, that the next place the confrontation would happen, there would be a bigger war. And maybe what Banning is warning against, a direct war between nuclear armed powers, which is something the world just can't tolerate. So we're caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. The war is horrible. It's generating just the amount of carbon that it's putting into the atmosphere is making the world a worse place. Of course, all of the death and destruction to everybody involved is horrible too. But we don't seem to have an alternative. And now why are these other countries? Well, they're benefiting from cheap oil. China's getting cheap oil, India's getting cheap oil. And so they're these parochial interests that get in the way of people thinking about what is the interest of the whole of the human race on the planet.
So that's a bottom-up view, Mark. You're saying, yeah, the economics is driving this whole thing, and everybody's trying to improve their economy, and that's why the world is falling apart. But it doesn't really give any handle for trying to resolve things.
Well, my only handle, Dennis, is political will.
I see.
I keep going back to that.
But the problem is, how do you get the political? But Geneva wanted to move on to what's the next question you wanted to ask, Geneva? We keep.
Yes, no, I'm just in the interest of time. We'll turn this to a different angle in slightly. So you've all kind of mentioned security, and this is often a word that's used to reference the aims that countries have, whether in regards to personal security, national security, food security, health security. So do you all think that the current strive towards, security, quote unquote, is meaningful? Is it being carried out correctly? And do you think there are particular actors or stakeholders, i.e. the military, that may have a role to play that's different than what they're doing at the moment?
That's a pretty broad question. Who are we talking about?
Well, my answer, Geneva, is yes. It's a broad question with a simple answer. The answer is yes. We have institutions that are focused on a 19th century view of the world, and we're in the 21st century. And there's things that we have to do. Yeah, okay, there has to be a line drawn. We can't allow these parochial interests to go too far and just cause total destruction. So there has to be a line, there has to be some kind of police force function. But we need the whole idea of security to change. We need the organizations responsible for global security, national security, and personal security to think about what are the polycrisis challenges and how can they not prepare for, not buy more guns to deal with to push back the refugees, but to do something to prevent the fundamental things that are causing these polycrises. And maybe it is a bottom-up approach, Dennis. I don't know.
Well, it just, we have this sort of pile up of nations and their governments and their government's desires on one hand, and we have a bunch of people who are living in countries all over the world who have quite different views. They're looking for basically a rather less exciting world, one where they get fed and have a place to live and can have families and so forth. And the two are really quite separate. The nations don't get. There's nobody. They need a den mother, or some group of people. Somehow there needs to be a mechanism like the Kim Stanley Robinson book has. This is a spoiler, but there's a way in which at least some of the most egregious of the malcontents get their lives taken in some fashion, and that improves things somewhat. Makes people feel a lot better too, I think. But I don't know if that's really the proper way to do it. How do we get a country to be responsible?
But interesting.
Go ahead.
I would jump in here that there's a guy who died not too long ago, unfortunately, Ben Barber, who wrote a book called If Mayors Ruled the World. And interestingly enough, a lot of the problems we point to are the nation state and at the state. I mean, look at the people of St. Petersburg or Moscow or Novosibirsk really care about launching a war for Ukraine. I kind of doubt it. This was very much a decision by Putin and his cronies for various reasons of a nation state variety. But from a city point of view, I've always laughed at the city of Shanghai. Did Shanghai and the people of Shanghai really care about the Senkaku Islands dispute with Japan or the South China Sea or even invading Taiwan? I doubt it. It's really the national leaders that are become really the most dangerous people often. And then they're often the guardians too, I mean, in a good sense. But so there's this kind of different levels of interest in how people see their security. So I think that the nation state is a real problem. I mean, going back historically, Hitler had a nation state that he took over and was able to mobilize the people to fight terrible wars. And so I think that's part of the question. But I mean, the other point is, what constitutes your security? I mean, go back to Shanghai. If you don't deal with climate change, Shanghai is going to be kind of gone. Sea level rise is going to take it out. It's going to take out Miami. Now, whether people care about Miami, I'm not sure, but certainly, a lot of cities in the world, London will be in deep trouble. So what is your security involved? Is it the immediate security of police keeping the homeless in track and dealing with crime, or is it worried about the long-term threats to the whole nation or the whole planet? How do you get people to look beyond the immediate terms of what security might mean to a longer-term threat? I mean, food security could be a real problem for the West. I mean, we're destroying the lands on which the food is grown, and slight changes in global temperature can have a huge impact on agriculture. I mean, our food security could even be at risk, which is the last thing I think most people in countries like the United States think they're going to run out of food. But so how do you get people to have a longer term perspective on what their security needs are, and to see that they have to take certain steps to ensure that kind of security? And I say, you know, when it comes to climate change, we are not resilient. I mean, you know, civilization and individual societies are a lot more fragile and subject to breakdown very quickly. I mean, even the strikes in Germany. I mean, there's a global, you know, there's nationwide strikes over transport for higher wages. Look at France. Look what's going on in Israel. I mean, nation states can come apart very quickly. My slogan is everything stays the same until it doesn't. And you can sort of count on the latter. You know, things, we don't move in a nice, you know, extrapolation. The future is just a little bit more of the present. Things, we reach tipping points and things change rather dramatically. Look what COVID-19 did to the world. I mean, to how we live, to lockdowns, to not only just the people dying. Look what the financial crisis did. And I'll tell you that in 1988, there weren't a whole lot of people who saw the Berlin Wall coming down in 89 and the disappearance of the Soviet Union in 91. You know, these things are dramatic. I mean, or I would say in the United States, we elected Barack Obama, you know, in 2008. And then in 2016, we elected Donald Trump. I mean, talk about, you know, dramatic shifts, but that also means that you can't look at the future as an extrapolation, that things can change in a positive way too, very dramatically. I mean, we did get Joe Biden rather than Trump too. So, you know, but I mean, it's on a global scale. So the future is not linear. We reach tipping points and things change very dramatically, very quickly. And so we don't know how that will work out. If you're smart, you try to figure out, well, how can you have the butterfly effect work in your favor? Small change that leads to a big shift. And this goes back to political will, because there are ways to things to happen that start to create political will. And I would say, actually, there's a dialectic between political will and things happening on the ground that help build political will. And even if we go to, let's just go back to electric vehicles and solar power, that you start to, you know, create a new tipping point. And I think we've reached a tipping point on electric vehicles. I think the ICE car is dead. It's going to take a long time to get rid of them all. And the Germans are even refusing, you know, the German industry doesn't want to, you know, mandate the end of producing ICE cars in 2035. But the public is going very fast toward ICE cars, and towards EVs, you'll realize that they're going to be cheaper to buy, a whole lot cheaper to operate and maintain. I have no maintenance schedule on. I just bought. There's no maintenance. And I spent $12 on electricity last month to power it. So from a long-term point of view, it's no question it's a cheaper view. But it's good. People are going to, for economic reasons, going to start seeing, hey, this is better. So how do you stimulate these changes that you want that are, you know, they're little pieces, because there's all kinds of little things that have to happen. There's not one big thing. It's not like, gee, we can win the war if we build an atomic bomb, you know, and once we put, you know, billions into that, we got this bomb, we end the war. That's not how it's going to happen. It's going to be, you know, lifestyle changes, going to be huge government policy changes, it's going to be subsidies, it's going to be changes in industry. And instead of making cars, we're making bombers. Well, instead of making, you know, diesel engines, we're making electric motors. Instead, you know, all of a sudden we're building massive amounts of solar power and you know, wind power, et cetera. We could do more of that, and it becomes very profitable. And, you know, you can get rich by going green is the things we have to do. So there's a whole lot of things and that is political will. I mean, you start subsidizing EVs and people say, oh, I want an EV. And actually that's good that the government wants to give me a subsidy. I get a $7,500 tax credit for buying an EV. So, you know, even if I didn't care about the environment, it becomes rational for me to do that. So how do you keep it's not going to be a simple, oh, all of a sudden we have political will and we're going to, you know, take on climate change. It's going to be lots of little things, but it could build a momentum towards more and more. Hey, well, we got to cooperate on a global level on this and much more seriously. And as crises happen, as we have these terrible events that are attributable to climate change, then that can be used again to build more political will to do the next step that people want to do. And there's an awful lot that can be done in industry and we haven't really talked about technology, but I see a lot of changes potentially on the horizon beyond just the EVs and solar power that could be very positive at basically doing a lot more with a lot less. In terms of production of the goods we need and do that, and changes in agriculture. There's all kinds of things that can be done. That's why I think that we have emerging opportunities as well as, huge existential threats and disruption. It's an age of disruption. It'd be constant change. I mean, look what's happened in technology for us old guys, what's happened in our lifetimes. When I grew up with a, party line, landline, right? And now I got my iPhones and all Apple Watches and everything else. I mean, there's a lot more, and the pace of technological change is accelerating. So, how do we harness that to do what we want the world to look like, rather than what it might be if we don't pay attention and we just let business as usual go on and take us to 4 degrees centigrade or whatever it is on climate change.
But you've got a problem there. You got a problem. How do you get all those things going? You have lots of, if we did this, we could do that, we can do this, we can do that, and so forth and so on. But getting that first step is impossible. Even when things are simple, we should just turn the atomic power reactors on again in Germany and replace power that we're making by using coal, which we abandoned, by nuclear reactors, which is clean and not involved in the carbon cycle, and reasonably safe compared to other things, compared to a coal plant, really safe. Why is Germany not back using nuclear power? Why do we have trouble getting various activities even started? And by the way, parenthetically, we have to replace all the dams along the Columbia River because they're aged out, and a lot of the hydropower that we're using and considering on the one hand as being a really good thing in the scheme of all things, it turns out to also be on the other side a really bad thing and needs to be gotten rid of. Because it damages the ecology of the rivers. So I mean, you have all these trade-offs, and there's nobody who makes any decisions that knows anything. And I have to say that I don't think our politicians are very smart, and I think they're motivated by things that have nothing to do with the long-term stability of our society.
All right. I'm going to jump in then to take us to our last question before we turn to the audience. And this is something, Dennis, that you know a lot about, even if perhaps our politicians don't, and that is technology and innovation, as alluded to by Banning. So we've all spoken about, obviously, technology playing quite a vital role in solving these crises and for the community moving forward. I guess my question is, what position is society going to need to be in to fully make the most of that level of innovation, particularly as we see more and more innovation coming from countries that aren't in the West, and how are we going to position ourselves to necessarily make the most of that and to make it worthwhile? Dennis, why don't you start us off?
Well, I think that we out there doing a lot of things in the technology area. One of the things that there's sort of like 3 important things to know about technology. One is that it's not so much about the science and the engineering that goes into it. It's rather that the organization of the groups that do it that's important. And we're extremely good at doing some of that. For example, we put men on the moon and some decades ago. And that was a rather straightforward engineering process that went remarkably well. And so I think that we have that kind of down pat. What we don't have is we don't have the support for large operations that need to be done, and a way of getting the populace and the funding agencies behind any of these projects. They tend to get caught up in the military-industrial complex, where the projects are more targeted towards generating income for a broad base of people and companies, and not solving particular problems. So they will build things in places that are useless or nearly useless from the point of view of the problem, and but has a low income or something of that order. Yeah, I just don't see that. The third thing we need is that there's a growing distaste for technology as a part of their society, and everyone just sends out a little note on their iPhone to their friends about how they really hate technology.
Yeah, that's the irony. Well, let me pick up on what Dennis said there. I recommend everybody take a look at the writings of Mariana Mazzucato, who I think is probably one of the most important economists of our time. But her focus is on the mission economy. And she points to the Apollo program and says, here we set out a plan or a goal to get to the moon within 10 years. And we mobilized 400,000 people, resources, and we did it. And it was government, it was a public-private partnership that did it. And her point is that the government needs to play a much bigger role in setting out the mission and then organizing the society to meet it, particularly working with private industry, but under the leadership of government. And she just wrote a new book called The Big Con on all the McKinsey and Deloitte and all the consulting firms that have been misleading government. They don't know what they're doing, but they offload these challenges to the consultants, and they've been destroying the capacity of government to lead. And if you think back in the United States, where after World War II, being a scientist, technologist in the government was a very prestigious thing to do, and you really did big things. And I always her first book was The Entrepreneurial State, pointing out that the 12 key technologies of your iPhone all came from government-funded research, from GPS to touch screens to cellular technology, all that funded by the government. And then, Apple goes off and exploits it beautifully, but they didn't invent any of this stuff. It was all government-funded research that led to it. But we need to do that again. So the government has to play a really big role here in leadership and working with and setting out the missions. What are we trying to accomplish? I've always believed that that's the way you look at it. What's the problem? What are we trying to accomplish? And then who do we bring together, or what resources or what ideas to focus on solving the problem? So we need to do that big time. And the other thing I would just say about technology is that I think the technology that we have already and then we see in sight allows us to do one thing that I think is really important. We can do more and more production of what we need, where we need it. That is to say, certainly with energy. You go to solar, wind, that's going to be produced pretty much where it's consumed or close to where it's consumed. And you don't transport sun and wind, transcontinentally. You don't put it in a box and send it somewhere, right? And so you produce your energy where it's consumed. And secondly, about that, what people seem to forget is that the fuel is free forever. You never pay for the sun. You never pay for the wind. You're not like an addict that every minute is paying for that gas, that oil, that coal that comes to run your energy system. You get rid of that, which of course has profound geopolitical implications for the petrostates. So you can produce your energy where it's consumed. You can produce more food where it's consumed and reduce the agricultural footprint, particularly for beef and for animals, with plant-based meats, with vertical farms. But there's a whole lot of technologies that will reduce the dependencies and the movement of food, but also its carbon footprint. And remember, food production is about a third of carbon emissions. So you can do that. And then with advanced manufacturing, digital manufacturing, you can do more and more production of goods where they're consumed, through 3D printing and advanced manufacturing. That's happening a lot in the United States. They're bringing home and I think if you noticed recently, well, it was about 3 or 4 days ago, the Relativity space rocket was launched and successfully through Max-Q, although the second stage failed, and it was 85% 3D printed. Which is huge reduction in waste and time to make the rockets. But 3D printing has a huge impact on the environment. There's almost no waste in the process. You can do much more where it's needed. You have fewer parts. There's a lot of things. So technology can do a lot to reduce carbon footprint, to be much more efficient, to bring jobs back to communities. There's a lot of things to be said. So, and with digitization and artificial intelligence, robotics, there's a whole lot of things in its store. If we mobilize them properly, can have a very positive impact on the environment, reducing carbon, creating jobs, taking us to a better direction. Whether we can outrun climate change is a big question mark, right? Whether we can do these things fast enough so that we don't have an unlivable planet. But in any case, there's a lot of potential, but it has to be mobilized in the right directions, incentivized. And I think government's going to have to play a much bigger role, positive role, and rebuild the capacity of government. Get the Dennis Allisons and the Mark Cummings in government, that helping make policy and helping manage. In World War II, just last point, the reason we won, that we mobilized industry and management. They had incredible managers who oversaw this huge and incredible effort to mobilize American industry to meet the war effort demands. It didn't happen just because industry did it. Government was in leadership, and some amazing managers working with the British in particular. So there's a lot that can be done, and we can't just throw our hands up, I guess, is what I want to say. And there's opportunities out there, and for people to make a lot of money in the process.
Well, sorry, Des, I'm just in the interest of time, I'm going to circle us back a little bit. And I think there is a great question from the audience, from Patricia. Thank you very much for your question, which says, can you think of any collective action challenge that the international community has successfully responded to that wasn't driven by an urgent threat? Are we all just doomed to be stupid frogs boiling in our pot of our own making? And I think that this can tie us back to our initial topic on political will to round off, in terms of, are we all doomed, or is there something that we can do to kind of create this political will and to move us forward? Mark, why don't you start us off?
So I look back at what happened with in the years immediately following the Second World War with nuclear weapons, and the emergence of an organization called the Union of Concerned Scientists. And this was a group of engineers and physicists and chemists who had developed the nuclear weapon technology, and then all of a sudden saw that they had created the potential to destroy the human race. And they came together, and they developed something that was very effective. It was the doomsday clock. And their activity actually resulted in a whole series of treaties. Unfortunately, some of those treaties have been allowed to lapse recently, but the Test Ban Treaty and the nuclear arms reduction treaties were all a direct result of the Union of Concerned Scientists. So we do have a model that says, if we can get people with a sense of real understanding of what we need on a community-wide basis in the community of the world, to come together and to think creatively and to act creatively, that we have been successful in the past, and I think we can be successful in the future.
On the question of people coming together, there are I don't know, probably hundreds of international organizations that governed, like, air travel, all communications. There's a lot of cooperation globally to set standards, to cooperate, to inform each other of any problems. So I think in answer to the question, that there is a lot of international cooperation. It's sort of like the news. If it bleeds, it leads. We don't have the news come and say, well, today, 5 billion people went to work and, they came home, kissed their kids, made dinner. That's not news. It's news that we had 6 people killed in Nashville. That's the news. So in terms of the international, you get on an airplane in San Francisco and you fly to Frankfurt, and then from there to Delhi, from there to Sri Lanka or something. It all happens seamlessly, right? When you leave on the airplane, you're going to be able to land in Frankfurt. Nobody's going to shoot you, or there's going to be they know how to land an airplane. There's aircraft control. All these things go on globally on a daily basis. Robert Wright wrote this wonderful book, Non-Zero: The Logic of Human Destiny, and he pointed out that we have this huge number of non-zero rather than zero-sum interactions with the world and with people you'll never meet. In other words, I know I have this non-zero, the people who build the airplane. I kind of have trust that they're going to try to build that plane so it doesn't crash. And then I have, some trust that all these people I'll never meet are actually working on my behalf, on my cooperative, they're going to maintain the plane. Then I trust that the pilot's not going to fly it into a mountain. And then I trust it's going to be able to land in the other country and I won't be arrested. All these things go on that are non-zero sum relationships on a global scale, billions of them on a daily basis. That's really pretty positive. That goes on, and we cooperate on a global scale now, which never happened, and obviously in the history of humanity before we had that technological capability to do so. So there's that to remember, that we actually do cooperate all the time on an international scale. It's just that some of these really big ones are we're failing miserably. But it's not that it's not possible. And I want to clarify, somebody put in a question, what I said about the energy is free, the fuel is free. I guess I wasn't explicit enough. Obviously, you have to pay for the solar panels, you have to pay for the grid, you have to build the infrastructure. What I meant is the fuel that runs it is free. We have to pay for coal plants, we have to pay for gas plants, but then you have to pay for the gas and the coal all the time. And so from an economic point of view, it's nice not to have to export the money from your community or your country or your family to pay Texas or Saudi Arabia for the fuel daily over and over again. You never have to pay for the sun. You have to pay for the solar panels, but not for the sun. And that's a huge thing from an economic point of view that we seem to never talk about when we talk about solar power. We talk about the installations are now cheaper than building a coal plant. But the coal plant, you have to keep paying for that coal forever. Once you have the solar, you just have to maintain the plant. You don't have to pay for the sun. And I think that's a really important factor that's sort of overlooked because it has huge geopolitical implications. So.
Dennis?
So I think we're in trouble. We spend.
I hear in River City with a capital T and it rhymes with P and it stands for pool, right?
Well, something like that, yes. We have all sorts of potential, and it would have been really nice to start about 1930 and work hard at resolving the issues and not getting ourselves the pickle we're in. We are in a pickle. It's not clear that we're going to get out, and the evidence right now is that we're going to sit around saying, "Don't look up," because you might see something you don't want to see, or don't look down and right, left, and so forth. And it just is extremely frustrating to watch where we are, and it doesn't seem like it's getting any better. We don't have people who are actively doing anything significant. We have lots of little stuff around the edges, and those are always gamed for somebody making a lot of money on something, and that's unfortunate, because in the long run, that's not going to solve the problem at all. It makes it worse. And we do have people who are in organizations throughout the world that are doing marvelous things. I mean, China has the development smarts for producing one new coal-fired electric power plant a day, so that they get several hundred a year as they need to maintain their power requirements. Now they could do it with other materials and perhaps do it better with solar or whatever, but they don't. They have a good design and they just replicate it. They also have, I think, been working very hard on solar and other things. China is not unaware of the existence of the problem, but they have practical considerations which dominate. And that's what everybody claims is the reason that they are not doing what's actually needed. The U.S. is as guilty as anywhere else, and Europe is not exempt from guilt, and the Far East is not exempt from guilt. But it doesn't look to me like anybody is moving far enough ahead to actually reliably say that in 20 years, 30 years, the major problems that we have now are going to be retired. The best we can possibly do, I think, is to try to keep the temperature of the water down so that we poach rather than get fried in the pot in which we're bathing. We'll make soup rather than stew.
Okay, boom.
All right, I think I'll take us there. As we close up, besides reading obviously Fair Observers articles and videos and the Ministry for the Future, which these three have inspired for me to read as I bought my own copy. Can the three of you give any other suggestions for listeners to maybe point them in directions of things that they could read, watch, if they're interested on this issue of political will, or perhaps, alternative futures? If you each have one each to point our listeners in. Banning, we'll start with you.
One book.
Your video.
That's hard. I think maybe I'm not sure, because I think Robinson, like I said, it's basically a plan. I mean, he wouldn't call it a plan, but okay, this is one way to get to a sustainable future in 30 years. Well, who's got another one? Let's look and see, for that kind of thing. So, I mean, the Mission Economy by Mariana Mazzucato, I think, is a new book of real interest. Martin Wolf has a new book on capitalism and democracy, and tried to show it. I mean, it's pretty clear. The problem is how does the market economy seems to be the most effective at producing goods for people and prosperity. But our market economy has become so distorted by financialization, by greed, by all the movement of all the wealth goes up to the 1/10 of 1%. We have to really transform our market economy and change, like I said, the incentives. What are the incentives? I mean, the rich have been setting all the tax rules. They've been setting out the incentives that the government endorses. How do we change that? So you got to think about those kinds of issues and who's addressing them. So I don't, off the top of my head, have a really good suggestion. I will say my favorite movie in this regard is Independence Day, because you had the whole world united to bring down the evil aliens. And by the way, they used the virus to do it, which is kind of ironic. So that's the polar opposite of Don't Look Up. which is, the doomsday asteroid is coming to get us, and nobody wants to look up and do anything about it. So what are we going to do? Are we going to unite as a world against the common threat, which is the pogo problem? The threat is us rather than aliens, or are we going to sit there and not look up and just let it get us into oblivion? So I think that's kind of the dilemma we face right now. And I'm on the side that we got to figure out how to get that Morse code going to send out the commands of how to bring down the alien ships, or the global warming, as it were.
No, those are some great suggestions there. Dennis, how about yourself?
Well, I'd say the Boy Scout handbook. It's a useful thing. It has a lot of things about how to build shelters from scraps in the woods, and how to build fires and so forth. When we move into the dystopian universe, there's a lot of knowledge we've lost, and we need to recover that.
That's a very different suggestion, but equally as great, I think. And finally, Mark, what about yourself?
So I would point to the Apple TV Plus Extrapolations series. And in terms of organization, I think the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Doomsday Clock is a really good model. And what I would close with is, for people who are listening to this, think about what you can do. If it's, maybe you want to speak in a webinar, maybe you want to write something that Geneva and Roberta and Atul will help publish in Fair Observer. It may just be a drop, but if enough little drops come together, maybe that'll begin to produce the wave that we need to create the political will to actually do something.
I don't think I could have ended in a better way. So all I will say is thank you very much to Dennis, Banning, and Mark for what has been an incredible webinar podcast. And I'm sure that we'll see many of you again, but a special thank you to our guests.
And thank you, Geneva, for a wonderful job moderating the cats.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.